Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Kelsey Evans-Amalu, and we're going to be going over the basics of brain development, especially when we take into account high stress environments and any interaction that we've had with traumatic stress, or if we have experienced PTSD or CPTSD, otherwise known as compounded PTSD. This in general is just the basics to help us understand more deeply the whys and hows of limbic system retraining. So I'll be going over a lot of vocabulary. So it's a lot of psychoeducation. So you might want to take notes for this. You can always rewatch this because there are some big words that maybe you've heard, maybe you haven't heard of, just to help develop a further understanding of how magnificent our body is. And we'll be examining this from two different perspectives, more from the neuroscience side and also the somatic side of things. So, somatic meaning the body, neuroscience meaning the brain. As far as trauma in the brain goes, there's been a lot more understanding and, of course, research done where it shows that trauma can greatly change the brain, meaning how we interact with the world, whether that is how we are viewing things, maybe how um, our neural pathways have developed. So there's a lot of interesting science that shows that trauma can change the brain. But the encouraging side of it, with neuroplasticity, um, fancy word for shifting the brain around, neuroplasticity was this, or is this idea that was cultivated really and understood really just within the last 10 to 15 years. And that, yes, trauma changes the brain, but also because of neuroplasticity, we have the power to create hope again, by healing. Healing also shifts the brain. We'll be looking through different lenses of the whys, the hows of the brain in general. Um, but we can also think of this as a big paradigm shift into how we're understanding trauma in the brain, especially with all the research that's been coming out in the last 10 to 20 years. And that if we're viewing it from a trauma-informed perspective and how our brain is working, many behaviors that are seen by anybody, and in our own human experience, behaviors could be a symptom of our trauma rather than a previous paradigm. And what was viewed is that it used to be that the behavior was tied to the person and that you were or are your behavior. But now this paradigm has come about, again, due to a lot of research and understanding more about the brain and the impact of trauma, and that a traumatic experience can create different behaviors in a person. So, the more accurate way to view a person might be to look more deeply at a person's trauma history versus if I'm meeting somebody on the street and just walking up to them and thinking like, wow, they're a really not kind person. Um, Previously, I might have taken that at face value versus now, I can create a lot more empathy and compassion for that person, especially if I get to know more about their trauma history that could have impacted their development over time. So in general, we're going to go over a lot of brain anatomy to help us understand what limbic retraining is. Um, and Brain Anatomy 101 can be viewed in a couple different ways because we're going to be talking about the triune brain, meaning the brain viewed in three different parts and how it's evolved over time. At birth, the structure of the brain is present, but it's definitely not fully developed. And just having a baby fairly recently, within the past year, it's been really cool to view brain development even just within a year and thinking about like what my baby is doing behaviorally can be tied to their brain development. So the brain is developed from the inside out, and it starts with the brainstem. The brainstem is really our primal brain. And you're going to see me do this motion a whole lot. So if you can look at the video, um, we can see the brain more like as our fist. The brainstem is going to be more my wrist area. So it's the origins of our more primal brain. This is composed of both neurons and synapses that are continuing to be developed and strengthened as we continue to grow and learn. So learning and repeated experiences definitely will create strengthened synapses. So if we look at this from a like anything that we are developing with our baby and the world that they grow up in, and this applies to any child in general, um, that positive experiences and negative experiences can create a strong synapses. So it's why there's been so much, and we'll talk about this more, there's been so much study of adverse childhood experiences, is that the adverse experiences of a child, especially when the brain is developing, can impact the growing brain. In helping define more about what neurons and synapses are specifically within the brain, we can think of this more as like electrical input. So it's basically, if my brain were a computer, it's the hardwire system of the computer. And this includes about 1,000 other neurons as well. The synapses are the things that connects neurons to each other. So within synaptic connection, we can think of this as whatever we're learning something and we're practicing it over and over and over again, that is increasing synaptic connection. So if I am thinking about, I used to be a high school teacher and I used to teach social studies. So my high school students, I knew that I had to keep repeating something over and over and over again to create a better synaptic connection. What's interesting is that synaptic connection is strengthened even more when the student is not just memorizing, because that's one particular part of the brain, but more learning in a hands-on way or project-based learning that will also strengthen synaptic connection. From a very early age, beginning at around 8 months of age of a person's life, the brain has about 1,000 trillion synapses, so that's a lot. The density of the synapses reaches its peak at around age 3. So from 0 to 3, a lot is happening in a baby's brain. Then about by age 16, the number of synapses has dropped to adult levels through a natural process called pruning. And we'll talk about neural pruning in our limbic retraining, because you can do neural pruning, even though that's a natural processes that happens in our early life. Neural pruning can also happen through mindfulness in our adult life. So pruning is an idea that we can think about like as we do not use something, we'll lose it until the levels level out. So if we're not using something continually, meaning I can think about so many times like my students went to have summer vacation, or even like this is probably more applicable. In the middle of the year, they would always have winter break, even though it was a couple weeks. They were not practicing their skill set of social studies content. So a lot of what would happen is they would lose understanding of the material, especially if they're not practicing it. So that could be a very small example of neural pruning. There's other examples that we could look at, but in general, you're going to see me bring this concept up again. But pruning is if we are not using something, we lose it. Other parts of the brain to consider before we get more into the stem, limbic, and then the prefrontal cortex is neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are these messengers within the brain where it's going to send chemical messages that are potentially positive or negative, depending upon how you look at it, that encourage us to think, feel, and move. Neurotransmitters, you're probably familiar with these two. Two examples are serotonin and dopamine. I often see this with clients where a lot of folks nowadays definitely have a dopamine addiction just because of how our society is structured. Um, so dopamine is definitely a reward system. Um, and we want to feel good. So we are constantly looking for things that produce these neurotransmitters. So it feels like almost like a quick hit um, of a drug. So, as far as trauma goes or high amounts of stress, the levels of key neurotransmitters in many children who have experienced stress or trauma tend to be either too high, too low, or they're generally out of balance. Um, so, if we've developed this from a very early age, then as adults, we're consistently looking for dopamine hits or something to feel good. And it's pretty readily available in our society are these dopamine hits. Like even if I'm going on the phone and I receive a bunch of likes on social media, that's a pretty instantaneous dopamine hit as it's ensuring like, hey, I'm a liked person. But those moments tend to be very fleeting. So we continue to go back, log on, post on social media for another quick dopamine hit. Other items include neurons and genes. Um, Epigenetics is definitely a thing. It's a science that has evolved and within the past 10 to 20 years, where we're seeing more about how trauma and generational trauma, ancestral trauma is carried on through generation to generation as it shifts our genes within each family. So how does this happen? Neurons are composed of genes. So there's about 30 to 50,000 genes in the human body. About one third to one half of these genes affect the development of our nervous system. So now we're kind of getting in more to the somatics understanding. So we have neuroscience, the brain, and then also with the nervous system, the somatic side of everything. At least half of these genes depend on our environmental stimulation to be activated, known as gene activation. So, this common argument of nature versus nurture starts to show up, where if it's an environmental stimulation that happens for gene activation, is it nature or is it more nurture? And it can be a combination of both. Kind of bringing it back to ACE scores um, for gene activation in particular. Um, there is experiences in childhood or early adulthood. They do influence brain growth. Um, this is known as gene transcription where if a neuron is activated, um, it will allow for growth and development of the brain. So we have positive childhood experiences and we have adverse childhood experiences, where positive childhood experiences can activate genes and create new proteins that strengthen healthy neural connections and promote learning. On the opposite side is adverse childhood experiences, which can inhibit gene activation or create more challenge in gene activation. And that will induce more of a lot of chemicals and hormonal changes that can actually delay the development of a human brain. So maybe you've been in therapy before and or maybe you know somebody where it seems like they act like the person that they were when the trauma happened. That's a pretty common experience where we can revert back if we've been triggered to the time of our trauma. So maybe some folks don't have the level of emotional intelligence or maturity because of a lot of trauma that may have experienced as a child or as an early adult, um, because it definitely impacts the brain overall. All right, so we've gone over a lot of the chemical side of everything. Now we're going to get back to the triune brain. So if you could join me in making a fist, doesn't matter which hand you use, but we're going to take our thumb in first and then close it up and then dial your fingers down. So you've just created your triune brain. So earlier I was referencing as for early brain development, it's mostly the brain stem that initiates. So we have the brain stem, the primal response. We can also think of this as our fight, flight, freeze response. Then I'm going to have to turn it a little bit. Right where my thumb is going to be the limbic system. So the limbic system is really in charge of our emotional response. Then finally, we have this part right here, which is our cerebral cortex or our thinking brain, our higher thinking brain. So again, the three parts, the triune brain, and this is a very generic understanding, but it's very helpful, especially if you're teaching anyone of all ages, so you can teach kids this too. Primal brain, fight, flight, freeze, emotions, and then thinking space. So we're going to first be going over the brainstem. I've already referenced it a little bit when talking about brain development in children. Again, think about fight, flight, freeze. The brainstem, the more primal response, is going to be consistently receiving and giving messages to the body. It also is the part of our brain that really is in charge of a lot of things. So since it's the part of our brain that really first develops, um, it is in control of the heart and the lungs, which is a pretty major deal. If we think about like when fight, flight, freeze happens somatically, um, it's another reason why, and also the vagal nerve that passes through all of these things as well. It's another reason why we have this response of our heart beats faster, our lungs might start to constrict, or we might start breathing a lot more quickly, because the brain stem is definitely the part of the brain that helps control that fight, flight, freeze response. So when we are in fight, flight, or even freeze, both the heart rate and breath rate shifts. The brainstem is also very much responsible to our instincts and drives. So because this is again one of the first parts of the brain that develops, as children, we're receiving a lot of messages very early on of what we're learning about in the world. So if I am in an environment, so I'm going to give the example of my baby right now. She's currently just started daycare a couple months ago. One of the things that she's currently learning, and we had to set up a routine just to establish like safety for her and familiarity that she wasn't going to be left there. We were talking to her very early on and telling her why she was going to daycare, and establishing again familiarity with the location, meeting the teachers, showing her that we were, like as parents, we were very caring about the environment that she was in. So we showed that we had care for her teachers, telling her that this was a safe place. So instinctually, she starts to pick up on that this is an okay place to be. Um, and that can really apply to anything and everything, especially when we're in early childhood. This is also part of the reptilian part of the brain. As mentioned, it's like I call it more of the primal. We can also think about this, the animalistic side of us. You might also want to refer to this part of the brain as the basic housekeeper. As mentioned before, a lot of the neurons and synapses are established within the brainstem, where it is responsible for the chemical balance. Um, and it will continue to be the place that is more responsive to threat throughout our lifespan. So the limbic system and the brainstem in general are constantly sending signals of are we safe. You can also call this neuroception. So neuroception is this idea of if I see something that I perceive as a threat, my body will have a response, like a physical response. And then based off of that physical response, the brain takes in that information and tries to identify, am I safe? And it can also be done vice versa because it happens very quickly, where if the brain sees something that it knows is, or maybe it, as a pattern, it hasn't been safe in the past, but maybe even if it's safe for you now, um, it will still send a signal to your body that it is not safe. The brainstem also controls hearing. And again, I'll talk about this from the somatic perspective too. Controls hearing, eye and body movements, voluntary motor function, motor control, sensory analysis, our levels of consciousness, vital bodily functions such as breathing and heart rate, and is the home of freeze, fight, or flight, um, which is generally the place that's triggered when we notice trauma. So, for thinking about this from the somatic side of things, like what's happening in the body, as we're establishing like familiarity again with some of these bodily functions, oftentimes if we've been in a high stress environment or have had trauma, um, we might be more in our fight, flight, freeze response pretty consistently. So it's why there's a psychosomatic response that tends to happen in the body where if I am continually in fight, flight, freeze all the time, my body is going to perceive that it's not safe and that our hearing shifts, like it becomes like more attuned, meaning like you can hear a lot of things. Your sensory sensory issues might start to develop or sensory sensitivity. There could be challenges with um, your motor function. Um, Maybe you might notice that your eyes are continually scanning side to side. Um, so all of this is in response to the neuroception of a trigger. Um, I think that this fact is very interesting and that 80% of kids from hard places or high ACE scores have sensory processing issues, only really responding, just reacting and not thinking. So talking at them doesn't tend to work because they're not operating from their thinking brain, which really hasn't developed yet anyways. Um, they tend to operate better with a sensory experience. So, something that feels safe for them, like sight, sound, smell, um, any of those sensory processing that they're taking in. All right. I know that we're talking about limbic system retraining, so I know that we've already gone through a lot of the Brain 101, but we're now defining what the limbic system is. Again, if we think about our triune brain, it's going to be right where my thumb is. Um, so this is the emotional and mammalian part of the brain. So it is formed after birth. Um, this part of your brain is continually evaluating, and it starts to assign meaning to what our body perceives. So again, we're going to go back to this idea of neuroception, in that whatever happens that it perceives like as a threat, there will be a bodily response. And then it starts to assign an emotion to that response. So um, this example just popped up in my mind. And I also just had a conversation with my acupuncturist, who is ironically afraid of needles as well. I am afraid of needles. I have been since a very early age. Um, there was a time where I was very sick as a child, and they were trying to see what these issues were because they were lung related. I had severe asthma. Um, and as a result, I had to give blood for the first time. I think I was like age 6 or 7. It was pretty early. Um, so I was terrified. Um, and even though I was able to give blood, um, one of the things that happened and still happens even when I give blood to this day, um, is I always, not always, but there's been many times that I fainted. So it's definitely a psychosomatic thing because I'm fully okay, like walking through the doors, um, no levels of real sickness. Um, but as soon as I sit down to give blood, um, my brain perceives this as a threat. I start to feel my body contract, get a little anxious, and emotionally, I've assigned meaning that I am not safe, I am scared, and then everything starts to shut down pretty rapidly. Um, this definitely is something that works closely with the brainstem. So, neuroception, meaning whatever it's perceiving, what emotional state, um, it creates our emotion and drives the physical responses to them. So, again, the psychosomatic response. This is also vital in creating memories. So, the limbic system, it's emotions are generally tied to memories. So when I think about that first time that I gave blood, I can pick it up very easily in my brain because there was an emotion tied to that response. Um, it can be more challenging to remember things early on in our life if there was a more neutral emotion. So we tend to remember things that are like extremely positive or extremely negative. Um, this also, with as far as learning goes, we learn emotions through our attachment styles. Um, so early on in our adult life, there's different attachment styles that show up, whether we're in a positive environment, negative environment. So when not attaching, meaning like if we're in a attachment style of um, more anxious or avoidant, it's very challenging actually to learn different emotions. So this could also be why folks have a challenging time of learning more about empathy and compassion, which those emotions, it takes a lot more of the prefrontal cortex to come in, um, versus just solely using the emotional response for the limbic system to learn empathy, because it's much more involved, compared to like fear or sadness. With this emotional brain, again, we can call it the limbic system or the reptilian brain, um, the combination of both the brainstem and the hypothalamus. Um, this is really also the heart of the central nervous system. So again, psychosomatic. Psycho meaning brain, somatic meaning body. Um, the key task for this part of the brain is to really look out for our general well-being, where it wants to detect danger, or if there's maybe there's like an incentive. It wants to also detect incentives or an opportunity that we might have. Um, how it does this is it releases hormones that can give sensations to the body. So this can look like mild queasiness, even to panic. So if the brain is starting to detect danger, there will be visceral sensations within the body that give you a clue that you are not in a safe space. Um, so a lot of the times what I see with folks, inclusive of myself, is I know that I am not in an okay environment where I don't feel safe, I should say. Um, if my heart rate starts to shift or I feel tightness in my chest, um, like maybe with public speaking in a new environment, I feel my stomach start to drop. Um, so in those environments, even though I know I have chosen to be there, I've had agency in that. There's still some responses that my body might have that might start to kind of like freak out. So there's the psychosomatic response that can develop from an emotion, and then we start to attach meaning to that. These sensations can be really small in feeling or large, and they influence small and large decisions that we make, meaning what we eat, what music we like, people that we're attracted to. The body is always talking and sending signals back to the brain. Um, Now we are back to our triune brain for the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is going to be, again, our highest thinking self. It's the part that is developed last. Um, I read something the other day that was stating that generally this part of the brain is developed around like age 25. What's fascinating is I was reading that this may actually be shifting even higher, a lot due to technology, which is really fascinating and kind of scary, that the cerebral cortex is taking a little bit longer to develop. Again, this was just from one study. It hasn't been fully proven, but I thought it was a very interesting response. Um, for this highest thinking self, this part of the brain helps us think in more abstract, symbolic, moral, and insightful ways. There's different lobes of the cerebral cortex. So we have the frontal lobe, which is in charge of judgment, forethought, the parietal, which is sensory processing, the occipital, which is vision, and the temporal, which would be memory, mood stabilization, helping to read faces and social cues, and also helps with our spirituality and meaning making. For the prefrontal cortex, I very much know this one very well, especially with working with students a whole lot. This frontmost part of the brain, which is just behind the eyes, has been associated in cognitive neuroscience studies to include processes like regulating the body and emotions, attuning to other people, whether we know that they're safe, reading their body language, listening to what they're saying. Um, it allows us to be more flexible, especially if we're in challenging situations. This is also the part of the brain that can have empathy and compassion for people and self-awareness. Being in touch with your intuition and morality, meaning moral judgment, and losing your fears. So overcoming any fear-based thinking. The frontal lobe is executive functioning. So for anyone with ADHD, that would be me. Sometimes this part within executive functioning can be a little wacky. So the frontal lobe is responsible for much of the executive function of the brain, which would include attention. So my ADHDers are always looking around, hard to focus, working memory, planning, organizing, forethought, and impulse control. Um, this is a different conversation altogether for neurodivergent thinking. Um, but as far as ADHD goes, the executive functioning is definitely impacted. Different neurodivergent um, across the spectrum, the brain is going to be impacted differently. So for autism, it can be a sensory processing thing. Um, as we're starting to look more and more at stress and trauma, we can start to think about how the brain is involved in this as taking the high road or taking the low road. And this is not a shame-based thing. It's just an analogy that I find very helpful when thinking about how our brain is processing stuff. So inside the limbic system, the thalamus takes in all this sensory information and integrates with our perception of things. Then, once it starts to like receive that information, this information is then passed down both the high road and the low road. The high road goes straight to the prefrontal cortex, meaning it's like this is the watchtower, this is our highest self. Um, and it can offer a view from like what's really going on. Um, where we might be able to analyze and respond in a more appropriate manner. Um, what happens with high rates of stress and trauma is that trauma prevents us from fully accessing our prefrontal cortex. And generally, we start to go the low road instead. The low road activates the amygdala, meaning I like to think of it like the smoke detector of something goes off, a trigger happens and the fire alarm goes off, um, which would then trigger the release of cortisol and our adrenaline, AKA our fight, flight, freeze response. The low road tends to be much faster than the high road. Um, so it's a very quick response, like just a couple seconds. Um, And if the prefrontal cortex is offline, meaning my highest thinking brain, we're more prone to react rather than respond. The amygdala, back to my brain, triune brain, this little guy, is our fear receptor. This begins to develop in utero and starts to fully function at 6 months gestation. So when we think of even high rates of stress amongst um, pregnant folks, um, the baby is beginning to receive that information instantaneously. And this can even trigger unconscious fight, flight, freeze mechanisms um, from a very early age. Um, the amygdala is also responsible for helping to process and regulate emotions. So when we start to get things back online, meaning the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, it's a wonderful way to work together to help regulate everything. The amygdala is also responsible of unconscious memories, aka implicit memories, and it's consistently taking in information from a sensory understanding, meaning through the five senses. A couple other items that we'll go over is the hippocampus, also located in the limbic. When the amygdala is triggered, the hippocampus is the thing that calls out um, the amygdala is what calls out and activates the hippocampus. Um, the hippocampus then begins to release more cortisol to really it's doing its job to help calm and regulate the brain. But sometimes, especially if we've had a lot of trauma, um, it might perceive something safe as actually something traumatic, and it'll have a higher cortisol response, even if it's something that is potentially safe. The hippocampus is also home to explicit memories, meaning our conscious recollection. And this is developed by age 3. This is home of short-term memory and rational decision making, meaning our cause and effect thinking. And then from about 6 months to 3 years, calming occurs externally until the hippocampus fully develops. So ages 6 months to 3 years, co-regulation is really important because the hippocampus is not developed. A child cannot soothe themselves because their hippocampus isn't developed. Then maybe like if somebody's had trauma in that space, co-regulation is going to be even more important, especially if the hippocampus doesn't ever fully develop. So if we're taking this all in now of what we've gone over, trauma sends an alarm, and then neurons really start to do their thing, or everything that you've developed, meaning the neural pathways that you've constructed, um, it becomes a pattern. So trauma is perceived, a trigger happens, and activates the brain's alarm system, meaning the low road. The alarm, the amygdala, communicates through chemicals and initiates a wave of neurotransmitters, including adrenaline and cortisol. Um, and this is again real-time response. The brain will then organize and change to reflect this pattern. So whenever trauma happens, this is how a new neural pathway can be carved out. We like to call this the hijacked brain. When the amygdala stays activated, meaning like it continues to repeat the stimulus without any regulation, the hippocampus continues to release cortisol to try to calm the brain down. The brain basically becomes hijacked and it continues to flood with cortisol. The limbic system will then lose its ability to regulate emotion. So, as far as beginning to understand how to retrain the limbic system, we're trying to basically take that hijacked brain and give it something further to work with to help regulate itself in real time.